Why is logging in Java so complicated? Well, it doesn't have to be, as long as we follow a few simple rules, whether we're creating a console app, a web server, a library, running tests, or anything else. So let's have a look at how we can keep things simple. We're going to have a demo application just like this. And back in the days before logging frameworks were a thing, we can always just print to the console output like this. However, if we want to save our logs to a file, roll them, generally have control over them, we really want to use a logging framework such as Log4j, Logback, or something else. So which should you choose? How do you configure it? Well, if you do it wrong, it's going to be complicated and cause a lot of pain. But if we follow a few principles and rules, it's going to be very easy. So I'm going to create an application that logs using first Log4j. So let's see how we can get started with that. So first we come over to our POM and we add a dependency on the Log4j API and the Log4j core, which is the implementation of Log4j. Now this is not actually best practice. So if you're wondering, should I be using something else? We're going to get to that later, but first, let's just get Log4j working. So let's go back to our main method. And generally, we can have one logger per class. So this is the Apache Log4j logger. I'll just call it log. And we can just call logmanager.getLog. If we replace this with, say, log.info and rerun, we get nothing logged. So we also need a configuration to tell Log4j what to do with the logs we are sending it. To do that, we simply add a new file in our resources folder called log4j2.xml. And I've got a prepared configuration here. It simply logs to the console with a specific format at info or greater level. You can see the Log4j documentation for more details on how to do this. I'm going to focus less on all of these features and more about how you package it. So let's try running this again. And you can see this time when we called log.info, we've got the date, the thread, the log level. This is the package name, abbreviated dev.codabin.consoleapp.main hello world. So that is all we need for a log4j config on a console app. However, we don't normally have zero dependencies when we're making something. We are often using things from other libraries. So what if another library is using Logback or some other Log4j configuration? How should they write their library, and how should it be consumed by you? Let's make a very simple app here. It's going to generate some random numbers, and we're going to use a utility function from a library that we make so that we can see how we should configure things. So we're going to print a number between 0 and 1000. We need a random number generator. Just like that. We need a number, right? So up to 1000. But I want to print this number padded with zeros on the left side. So for this, we're going to create a utility function in a different library. So this is how we're going to use it. Let's call it stringutils.paddLeft. And we give it the number we made and say we want it to be 4 characters. So let's create this class in our separate utils library. So I've created a stringutils class here already, which is currently empty. So let's just add a reference to that and we will create this method in there. Okay, so this is the length of the string we want. So how are we going to do this? First, we're going to convert the number into a string. Yes, just like that. And then the number to add is the length we want. For example, 4 minus the length of the string. So if it's a number between 0 and 9, the length is 1. Therefore, you want to add 3 zeros. Okay, but let's also make sure we don't go below 0. So at least 0 to add. And let's log this as well. So if we want to log something in here, we're going to have to add log4j to our library as well. So let's do that very quickly. I'm going to copy the dependencies. We've got two dependencies. Let's just put them in there. Okay. And tell IntelliJ. Take note of that. We need a configuration file again, so let's copy that into there. Okay, and just like before, we can create a logger, so an Apache logger. And that's the logmanager.getLogger. Okay, and let's just log the number of zeros we're adding. Okay, and then we can simply return a zero padded string. Okay, I think that's going to work. Let's go back to our main method. So there's our padded information. Let's just print that. Okay, so you see we've got different logging going on here. This and this is from our console app. This is from our library. But this is where the problems can start. Because there are multiple logging frameworks out there, and so you're not generally going to be using exactly the same logging framework as all of your dependencies. So what happens if your application uses, say, Logback, whereas your dependency is using Log4j? Well, first of all, let's use Logback. Logback is an alternative to Log4j. It's quite popular, but I'm not going to say if it's better or worse, although I do generally prefer to use it. So Logback has a different configuration file. Let's delete this. There are many ways to configure it. I'm going to stick to XML, and I'll paste in some config. The format is a little different, but it's actually quite similar to Log4j. We define appenders such as console appenders. We'll go over file appenders later. And we define what level we're going to log at. So finally, if I refresh our Maven project to get Logback, we no longer want to use these Apache logging libraries. So we're going to use this SLF4j logger. Now this is because Logback is an implementation of the SLF4j library, which we're going to go over shortly. Initializing the logger is similar to before, and using it happens to be the same as well. So let's just log this and see what happens. Okay, that's interesting. We've now got two different styles of log formats. And in fact, we've got two different log implementations on our class path. Let's just change our appenders a little bit to make it really obvious where our log lines are coming from. So this is our Logback pattern. And then in our library, this is our Log4j. If we rerun this now, we can confirm we're getting logs from different log frameworks. Now, the solution to this problem was to introduce an API called SLF4j, or the Simple Logging Facade for Java. And nowadays, it's considered best practice to use SLF4j for all logging. So let's come back to our console app, and we're going to use SLF4j API. We're going to use this at compile time. At runtime, the implementation we're using is Logback Classic. To make sure we're not using it directly, I'm going to set it to a runtime scope. Let's do the same for our library. For a library, we're going to log using SLF4j. In order for Log4j to work with SLF4j, we need to add a separate dependency here. Now you may think these should both be runtime dependencies. I'm going to set that for now and make sure we can still run things. Okay, let's refresh this. And now we're getting some errors because we no longer have Log4j directly as a compile time dependency. So we need to come back and use these slf_j loggers. So we go logger factory.getLogger stringutils.class. We can't actually run this easily, so let's create a test so we can run this and make sure it works. So let's make a stringutils test. So void pad left works, okay. And let's just assert equals, so let's say we expect 0008 if we pass in stringutils.padLeft 8 the size of 4. If we run this, we should see our logging come through from log4j. Okay, this is our log4j logging. Great. Now let's come back and run our main method again. Now the first thing you notice, it did work, but we've got this big error. Class path contains multiple slf4j providers. So it says it's found an org Apache logging slf4j, that is log4j, and it's found the logback provider too. So there should only ever be one implementation of your logging framework on the class path at any time. And who should decide which logging framework? Well, it's not the libraries that you use that should decide that. It should be you if you're creating an application. So the way to fix this is to remove any logging frameworks from either compile, runtime, or other scope except for test. So we're going to change this to the test scope. We're going to reload this. So let's make sure we can still use these in a test. Okay, here is our log4j test config. And then when we run our main method, now you can see all 3 log lines, even the one from our library, is using logback, which is the library we want to use. So there's one other thing to note, is we still have this log4j XML file as part of our dependency, which we should not include in our library. So one option is we add a test resources directory and move this here. But I actually feel using something like log4j or logback for a library is often a bit overkill. Instead, we can use a very simple implementation, which is great for tests. So we can delete our config, we can delete all the log4j dependencies, including that one. So we've just deleted 3 dependencies. We need to add one back. It's called slf4j simple. slf4j simple is part of the slf4j API project, and this is the most simple logger you can get. By default, it just logs to the console, no configuration needed. It is still a framework though, so make sure we got that test dependency there. Now I'm going to reload this. Let's run our test again. This is what simple slf4j looks like by default. It doesn't print the time, just the thread, the class name, and the log line itself. You can configure this with the properties file. And once again, if we run our main method, it's all logback. If we look in the dependency tree of our console app, you can see we've got a dependency on our library. The only dependency it brings in is slf4j API, which we define as well. And then we have this runtime logback dependency. Okay, so next up, how do we log to a file instead of to the console? So instead of logging to the console, we can log to a file. I have some configuration prepared here. And by the way, you can copy and paste all of this from the GitHub repo. It's linked in the description. So this is an advanced file appender. By default, it's going to log to logs/practice.log, but also at the end of each day, it's going to rename the day's logs file with today's date, and then it's going to create a new log file. It's going to delete old files, and we can also get it to gzip old logs. So now if we run this application once again, things have worked, and we can see in our log directory here it's generated this log file, but it hasn't printed anything to the console. So one option we have is to add another appender here which logs to the console as well. So let's paste in the config for our old console appender, and we can simply duplicate this file and say, hey, print to standard out too, please. So now it's going to print to standard out and to our log file here. However, generally we don't want to log to the console if we're logging to a file. Instead, we can have some test specific config by creating a new file in our resources directory. So if we put it in our test resources directory and we call the file logback-test.xml, and let's just quickly copy in the console configuration here. So I'm going to delete the file appender. Okay, so our test config has simple console appender. We can delete the console appender from our main file here. And now anything we run from our test directory is going to use logback test XML. When we deploy and run this on a server, for example, logback test will not be on the class path, so it will use logback and log to a file. To make sure this works, we can just add a test for our main method. Let's create a new test for that. And it's not going to be much of a test. Let's just make sure it doesn't throw an exception or anything like that. So if we try running this, it should log to our console, just like that. Whereas if we run from the main method directly, we should see no console output, but our log file will be updated. Here it is. So let's review the rules about how to declare dependencies on the various log frameworks in order to keep things simple. The only compile time dependency should be SLF4J API. For libraries, only add test scoped dependencies on something like SLF4J simple, or logback, or log4j, or whatever your preferred logging framework is. For apps, whether they are console apps, web servers, or other, add a runtime dependency on the logging framework with config. For libraries, no config should be included in the dependency. Now there is one more gotcha you might encounter sometimes, especially with old dependencies which depend on Java util logging. So Java util logging was a bit of a disaster. It was added into the Java library, so still exists there. Some things still use it. The idea was to be like SLF4J. However, it really failed, but sometimes you need to deal with it. So let's create an annoying string utility class, which instead of using SLF4J, like a good library, we're going to use Java's built-in Java util logging logger. So logger.get logger get name. This is how we define a logger. Now if we use this class from our console app, let's see what happens. So I'm going to use annoying string utils and rerun that. Okay, I'm going to run it from our test method so we get our correct logger implementation, and you can see something happening here. So this line is from our console app using logback. These two are using the built-in Java util logging, and finally back to our logback again. What we really want to do is redirect any Java util logging to SLF4J so that it will go through whatever we want to use, logback in this example. So in our application, we can add a bridge. So JUL to SLF4J does what it says. It's a bridge from Java util logging to SLF4J. And we need to keep it compile time dependency because we need to initialize the class. So to do this, we come to the top of our main method and we need to run 2 magic lines from this bridge. So the first one is removing the default config, and then we install it. Now when we rerun things, the annoying string utils are going via SLF4J as well. So there's one rule to add to our rules. If any dependencies use Java util logging, then use JUL to SLF4J. And let's look at another scenario. What if a library you depend on does introduce another logging framework, such as Log4j? Well, as we saw before, we're going to get these annoying error messages about multiple providers on the class path. Now, the best solution is to simply delete this from the library, but if it's not your library and you can't do that, all you can do is exclude the logging framework from the dependency. So in this case, the dependency is coming from utils library, and we can add exclusion rule on this. So we're going to exclude log4j simple and log4j core. Now when we run it, we are back to using our own configuration and our own framework that we want to use. So final rule, exclude logging frameworks from misconfigured dependencies. And that's it. There are a few edge cases. In general, it's very easy. Write all your code against the SLF4J API, and then pick one logging framework for your application and add a simple framework just for running tests. Hope that was useful.